All right, so our final presenter before we break real quick is Christian McMahan. He's a partner at Smartfish Group, a former CMO of Heineken, and he's here to talk about, how you stand out basically in this crowded marketplace. I mean, we've seen the numbers this morning, 3,000 plus breweries out there. It's getting crowded, and in order to compete alongside all those new brands, you got to have a real clear and concise message. You got to give the consumer a reason to come back and purchase your brand multiple times. So he's going to come up here and kind of show some examples of how some of the successful companies over the years, large and small, have been able to refine their messaging, tell their narrative, and really brand themselves as a choice that consumers come back to constantly. So Christian, come up, take it away.
Thank you. I do need that. All right. Thanks, Chris. All right, so I'm actually a product of the three-tier system. I actually got my start running some bars, and then for most of the 90s, I actually went into sales for Boston Beer Company. I went door to door with my six-pack of beer, telling people that they should try it, and I'd get kicked out saying, no, I have Heineken Dark, I'm good, or I don't pay that much money for American beer. Then went to go run a wholesaler, went to Diageo, eventually became head of marketing in the US for Guinness, and then Heineken USA. So, and now with my agency. So great perspective in seeing it from all sides, the retailer, the wholesaler, from sales, from marketing. And it's just real interesting now, now that I'm out of that and kind of looking in and working with companies about all the things you learn along the way. So a bunch of stuff to go through. It's going to kind of go fast because I want to show you guys a bunch of stuff, but we'll get into it. So overall, the agenda, a few things we're going to do. So give you a couple opening thoughts, and then I'm going to break it down to three things: how you communicate your brand, right? The strategy behind your brand, and then the one thing that you have to get right, which we'll talk about. And then just some what I wish I knew back when I was a brewer or a client that I get to know now a bit, and then open to questions at the end. So. Opening thoughts, just a couple thought starters for you all. A couple things about marketing, like what's your story? We're going to talk about the DNA, and you've heard that quote, just be yourself because everyone else is taken. And so many times now in the last couple of years since we started Smartfish, we've gone in and people say, oh, I want to be the Sierra Nevada of X, or I want to be this brand because I think they're cool. And you have to say, well, but that's not you. Who are you? And it's a real important thing about your DNA, and we'll talk about that. The road to Cooperstown. It's funny, I had this conversation at the bar last night with someone. In baseball, if you play 10, 15 years, you're successful 1 out of 3 times at the plate, which means you hit .333 for your career, you're in the Hall of Fame, right? 1 out of 3, you're in the Hall of Fame. It's kind of like marketing. All right? Everyone gets up there and you meet a bunch of marketers and they're going to tell you about their awards and all the great things they've done. They don't tell you about the strikeouts. And I'm going to show you an example of one craft brewer who had several strikeouts and before they finally got it right. The three-legged stool. When we, as a marketer in this business, we learned early on there's 3 legs you have to worry about. Obviously the consumer one. Does the consumer get your brand? But then you have the retailer, right? Are the things you're doing able to translate at retail and be effective? And then you have this third tier called the wholesaler, who's got X amount of brands, and he's got to make choices. So everything you do from a marketing standpoint has to penetrate that 3-legged stool. Is it good for the retailer? Is it good for the wholesaler? And ultimately, is it good for the consumer? And if you're not hitting one of those legs, you're vulnerable. The new reality, 78% versus 14%. What does that mean? So in the latest study with consumers, 14% of them trust what they hear from a brand, what they hear from you directly. 78% of them trust what they hear from their peers. It is all about peer recommendation. We all do it, right? I mean, I'll go on and I want to go to a restaurant, and will I go to that restaurant? Or will I go to the New York Times review to see what someone's saying about it? No, I'll go to Yelp, right? And I'll read 10 reviews and I'll form an opinion. Mary from Omaha, Nebraska could be insane, but I'm trusting her ahead of the New York Times critic because I think she's one of me, right? So the difference now is, for marketers is it's no longer about talking to consumers, it's about enabling them to talk to each other about your brand in a positive way. That's a major shift from 10 years ago when it was just a one-way conversation. You have to get consumers talking to each other about how great they think your brand is. That's the secret sauce today. And the 5 Ps, you know, traditionally in marketing, you grew up in it was like the 5 Ps. You have to have product and price and promotion, et cetera. And that's not true anymore. It's changed, especially in this new universe with digital. It's, are you social, are you local, and are you mobile, and do you have the content to make it work? Solo, mo-co. It's funny, because content is king. You hear that all the time. I was speaking at a digital conference a couple months ago, and I was at a panel with Google and Twitter, and I said content's king, and Google stood up, well, distribution's queen, and she wears the pants. Which, if you're Google, that's probably the right thing to say. But you have to have great content, and we know that from campaigns that work and get out there. It's one thing to buy space, it's one thing to have that Super Bowl ad, but when you can create content that obviously goes viral and has consumers sharing it with each other, again, that's the difference of 78% versus 14%. Anyone can buy a $500,000 ad, you know, on the American Idol final and talk to a consumer, but we all know it in our social feeds, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter. When you get something sent from a friend, you're way more likely to open it than get it fed on the advertising panel on the right-hand side. That's a major change in how you do it. And we even know it now when we click on something, right? We click on a video and an ad on YouTube, right? And this is what Google's done really well with YouTube. You get that 5 seconds where you can skip the ad, right? We all seen it, 5 seconds, where it plays and then you can hit the button and you can skip the ad. Very smart technology that they've put in. So that means when you make content, those first 5 seconds have to penetrate and impact. It's not like you can kind of build and get to the end line. They're just going to click you and you're gone. Now it's got to change. Now you've got to really get them right out of the gate so that they want to see what else is going to come. When you develop WORMTOWN, when we develop content for our clients, we think about those 5 seconds. All right, so let's get into a couple examples. When we talk about, and Chris and I talked about, you know, the group here and what we want to do in refining your brand narrative, I said, well, there's so many, you know, great inspirations I can share. Guys want to talk about Goodfellas and Braveheart and Gladiator and Godfather. And for this room, Strange Brew. I'm going to use an example I can't believe I'm going to use to help drive this point home, and I've never used this before. It's from that legendary movie, The Legend of Bagger Vance. Okay, show of hands, how many people have seen this movie? Whoa, way more than I thought. For those that haven't, it's a Robert Redford movie. It's The Natural with golf clubs. All right? It's the same thing. But when we talk about this topic of refining your brand narrative, right, there's a real interesting segment in this movie that really rings true for this group. And I'll play a video.
If inside each and every one of us is one true, authentic swing, something we was born with, something that's ours and ours alone, something can't be taught to you or learned, something that got to be remembered.
Whoop. So the Fresh Prince said a few things there that really ring true for this audience. And I'll just pop them all up. Again, this was all in that 15 seconds that you just heard. Okay, it was actually hard to find that clip, by the way, on YouTube. But inside each and every one of us is one true, authentic swing. Something you were born with, something that's ours and ours alone, something that can't be taught, and something that has to be remembered. When you all are in with your brands and trying to find your way, that's what it's all about, right? Like I said, you have to be you because everyone else is taken. And every time with consumers, when you talk about the brands that are successful, authenticity matters. You know, I had the great pleasure during my time at Diageo to manage their RTD category in the mid-2000s, Smirnoff Ice, Captain Morgan, all those brands, right? And the one thing that we really learned watching that category through the years was that category hadn't changed since the days of Zima. Zima came, I always joked when I was early in my Boston beer career in the early 90s that Zima was a 10 million case brand that no one admitted to drinking to, right? I don't know, no one drinks Zima. It's selling 10 million cases, someone's drinking Zima, right? Someone please stand up. And then that Zima became Mike's Hard Lemonade. It became Smirnoff Ice. It became Four Loko. There's always been that alternative to beer category. Now, a lot of that's really shifted to cider, right? We obviously know what's going on with cider. And obviously, cider works where those brands don't now because of why? It's authentic. It's got a lot of the same qualities that craft has. And that obviously resonates much more with consumers today. So the Smirnoff Ice, the Mike's, and those brands are on the decline, but cider's rising because it's really taking the equity. That's why craft is where it is today, and applying that to that same alternative to beer category. That category's been around, except for Zima. Zima's no longer around. So let's get into a couple examples. Communicating your brand. I'm going to give you an import example and a craft example, and some of these are TV related, but communicating your brand can be anything. It can be how you post on Facebook. It can be a video you do in your brewery. It can be, communication doesn't have to be thinking TV ad. You know, the days of the 30-second TV ad are gone, right? It's really about creating content that can go anywhere you want. You decide, but create that great content. But one learning certainly I had during my time at Heineken was around Dos Equis. You know, everyone talks about Dos Equis and blah, blah. Dos Equis was like, it was a 7-year overnight success. And it wasn't new. It wasn't just brought to the US 5 years ago. But what it was everyone that tried to crack Dos Equis during the 80s and 90s, and it had a few different import companies that had it before Heineken did, was they just tried to apply the Me Too thing to Corona, right? Well, it's about beach. We need beach imagery. We need to do this. We need to do that. That's what works for Corona. We should put it in a clear bottle. You know, Corona's 80 million cases now. It's 90 million cases. We need it to attack Corona, right? It never worked. The brand lagged. And then there was a big, long project, and again, it took a long time. It was almost a year and a half to crack the code. And the real insight was, listen, this is not about being a beer from Mexico. This is about being a sophisticated lager that just happens to come from Mexico. And the expression of that idea was the most interesting man in the world, Jonathan Goldsmith, who hadn't had any job since he was a ranch hand on Dallas in the late 70s. It's depressing when I tell that story. I'm glad people laugh, because when I say it to my team and all the designers and creatives, no one, what's Dallas? And it's so depressing. So, and then I say, it's like Dynasty. What's Dynasty? I'm like, never mind. But it wasn't just, we're going to put this guy on TV and people are going to buy it. It's like, we had to get consumers to care about him. And everyone sees ads, and you don't really know the strategy that's behind it. And what we had to do with the campaign is break it down. And it's interesting, you won't know it now and you'll see it, is we had to divide it into 2 areas. Every year when those ads rolled out, you were hit originally with what's called the Legend campaign. And these were the ads that told his story in a way so you understood who he was. And I'll just play a couple of those to root it in.
His reputation is expanding faster than the universe. He once had an awkward moment, just to see how it feels. He lives vicariously through himself. He is the most interesting man in the world.
I don't always drink beer, but when I do, I prefer Dos Equis. Stay thirsty, my friends.
And I'll play one more.
He is the life of parties he has never attended. If he were to punch you in the face, you would have to fight off the strong urge to thank him. Sharks have a week dedicated to him. He is the most interesting man in the world.
I don't always drink beer, but when I do, I prefer Dos Equis. Stay thirsty, my friends.
There's one line in there that you heard, sharks have a week dedicated to him. And we all know that. And what would happen, every year you make the ads, you go down to Mexico to present it to the brand owners and show the work. And I never thought about it. We bring down the ads, we have their board, and they all look at us and like, I don't get the shark line. And you never really think, like, trying to explain Shark Week. Well, we have this week in the US, it's called Shark Week, and it's on the Discovery Channel, and it shows about sharks. And it's like this pop cultural hit, it's amazing. Dead silence. You gotta trust us, it's a funny line. Okay. So anyway, all those stories are right about building this authentic guy, right? This story around who he is and why you should listen to him. And what people don't realize is there's actually two most interesting mans in that, because there's a younger one, and then there's the older guy, Jonathan. So there's the Jonathan can't go anywhere now without being recognized. That's his beard and the whole 9 yards. He actually moved to Vermont because he was living in a boat in Marina Del Rey, and he couldn't go get a carton of milk without being mobbed. But that's how we always see the campaign. So when we launched it every year, we only played those ads for the first 30, 60, 90 days because we wanted you interested in him and who he is. And then once we got you strategically, we said, okay, now let's communicate some wisdom. It's called the Wisdom Campaign. Things that now make him more relevant to you. Why is this brand for me? Because that's a big thing with consumers. When we ask them, name the brands that are relevant to you, brand for me, and they'll reel off brands. And you want to, how do we get Dos Equis in that conversation? Well, then we had to relate to the guy, that male 21 to 29 guy. So then we came up with a series of ads called Wisdom Campaign, and these are those example of those. Play that one again. Yeah.
There's a place you can go to meet new people. It's called a bar. Stay thirsty, my friends. I have no idea what this is. Stay thirsty, my friends.
Yeah, that wasn't a proud moment either. So that was the first year after Heineken had arranged the global purchase of CCM and bought the brands, so Dos Equis, Tecate, Sol, etc. We moved from flying to Monterey to present the ads to fly to Amsterdam, and we presented to the board, very senior Dutch and Belgians. And having to explain manscaping to that room wasn't my greatest day. I don't know if they fully ever understood it, but we got approved. But again, that now related to the demo, right? And we said, okay, we made you interested in who he is, and you bought into him. And it got so crazy with consumers on Facebook and everywhere else. Like, it was almost hard to do fresh creative because everyone was coming up with their own lines. We're like, oh, we love that line. Now we can't use it because you posted it. And that's when you know you had something. So when you look at the success of the campaign, it obviously has been successful. We know that. It's won all kinds of awards. It's crossed over into pulp culture, Saturday Night Lives, the daily shows of the world. I mean, you could go on and on how many times it's spoofed. But did it work? Did it really work, right? Well, we know it did. Why? It's been the fastest growing import in the US for the last 5 years. It was the first brand. This is, when you think about Dos Equis, it's 0.0005 of the global beer population. It was the first brand on Facebook, organically too, with no paid, like we didn't have 10,000 people bought in Malaysia to join the Facebook page. It was the first brand to reach 1 million fans on Facebook. It's won a ton of awards, and I think one of the most important things was there was a set of internal rules developed called the MIM documents, the Most Interesting Man documents. And what it was how do we keep this idea fresh? Because we can't have a new idea in 2 years. And what was interesting, after we launched this campaign nationally, it was 2009. The next year, Old Spice came out with that campaign, the guy like you should smell. And funny, amazing, but they broke right out of the gate 5 of the rules that we had that said what we wouldn't do with the Most Interesting Man. And what happened? Sure enough, 2 years into that campaign, gone. They had worn it out, it was tired, and Old Spice, it took years for them to come up with the next thing. So the idea is when you get your message right and you get your story right, keep it authentic, right? Because you want to kind of keep driving the same message continually, not have to evolve and not have to wear it out. And that's super important in really how you define your brand and what you want to be. So second example is Sam Adams. And everyone looks at Sam Adams and says, wow, look at them and how big they are. And they've done it all. But you don't know the journey they've taken. And it's funny, even when I was starting to pull some stuff for this thing, I realized how many times they've changed a label. Like it felt like every other year there was a new label. When I started, it was the one in the bottom left for the longest time. And then no, we got to make them younger and have them cheers. And it's not even Sam Adams, by the way, that's Paul Revere. Because you don't want Sam Adams, if you saw a picture of him on you wouldn't be drinking it. So that's actually a portrait of Paul Revere. And then he's evolved, no, we got to take him off because it doesn't appeal to multicultural consumers. Now he's back on because that's our heritage. But this is the classic example of you got to keep swinging until you get it right. And their biggest learning was in advertising. When I was with the company in 1996, they're like, we're going to do TV ads. We hired Wyden Kennedy out of Portland, who was famous at the time for the Nike campaign and the Starbucks, and they do all the Coke work. And back then, they do all the ESPN SportsCenter ads, and they're a very famous advertising agency. So this is going to be a big thing. We've cracked the code. We're investing in TV. And I remember going to that first meeting where like, here's our ad. And I actually got the original, very first ad Sam Adams put on national TV.
Do you love beer? Can you name the 4 basic ingredients of beer? Have you ever floated a bottle cap on the head of a Sam Adams? If you could only have one thing in your refrigerator, what would it be? Can you imagine a better job than being a brewer at Sam Adams? Do you love beer?
Drinks before lunch?
And then we were like,
Water's fine for me.
what was that? Guys, can you cut that? Then we were like, what was that? Like, we need awareness. And you spent 25 seconds not even talking about Sam Adams. You were advertising beer. And they're like, yeah, but doesn't it make it feel great about being a Sam Adams brewer? And we're like, no, I feel terrible. The next follow-up to that, they're like, have you ever had a Novemberfest? And so then we had people saying, how come I don't carry November? We had wholesalers all mad about not knowing about Novemberfest. And that was what we were telling consumers for the first time. They'd never heard of Sam Adams, and that's what they're learning about the company. It was an epic failure. We wasted almost a year and a half on those ads, and it did nothing for the brand. All right? So then they came up with the next campaign and said, oh, well, now we've cracked the code. Watch this. And then I'll show you this ad.
Drinks before lunch?
Water's fine for me.
Water for me too, but with lemon, please.
I'll have a Sam Adams, please.
Make that 2 Sam Adams.
Oh, I'll have a Sam also.
Me 4.
Nice. Never miss an opportunity to enjoy a tasty Samuel Adams lager, especially when it's on someone else's tab. Samuel Adams, always a good decision.
Are you kidding? Is this a joke? That's our ad? Yeah, it's great. It's going to drive consumer purchase decision, and it's going to really elevate us to the next level. Did nothing. It was horrible. There's actually, and Chris pulled it up yesterday, if you Google search on YouTube or YouTube search, David LaChapelle spoofing that ad with Samuel L. Jackson, kind of puts in perspective how bad that ad really was. But what did Sam Adams always had going for it? They obviously brewed quality beer. They're known very well throughout the country of having excellent people, sales force, et cetera. And they said, finally when they got it right, and they said, we should be talking about what we think our strength is versus trying to be something we're not. And said, let's just talk about who we are and our DNA. And if you think about the campaign, it was developed by an agency called Octopus out of New York. When they finally started doing the Who Do You Love music from George Thorogood and talked about all of their different beers and their people and the passion that they put into what they do, that's what unlocked the growth for them. And a couple examples of that are here.
When you open a Samuel Adams lager and begin to pour it out, you get this beautiful amber color, and you put your nose in it, and you get the smell of flowers called hops.
We use noble hops. They are expensive, but it's a better quality ingredient for Boston Lager.
Most brewers have a dash of hops.
We use a pound of hops per barrel.
We add some caramel malt to that, significant full flavor, but everything is there in balance.
The proof is in the taste.
One more. And when you think about the model, right? They've always had a good route to market. They were strong at retail, obviously strong with wholesalers. They made good products, but they never had that message right to their consumers. They never cracked the code. So finally, once they did, you said, okay, well, what's going to happen to the brand? Well, I think we know what's happened in the last, over the last 6, 7 years. Obviously driven by the growth of Sam Adams, but then obviously when they launched Twisted Tea and Angry Orchard, clearly the last 3 years have had an accelerator. And, if Terry Hopper's in the room, who was an original Boston beer guy in the early 90s, if you said this is what the world would look like in craft beer 20 years later, and Sam Adams would still be growing in that environment, we would have thought you were crazy. But they finally got everything right. And those ads, it was because they finally decided just to be themselves, and that resonated with consumers. The next thing is talking about strategy. Okay? Not everyone can do TV, not everyone can even do video. Everyone can have a strategy. Strategy should be before everything. What are you going to do, okay, and are you going to stick to it? Do you have the discipline, right, and the vigor to really stick behind what you stand for? And probably the best example in the spirits world coming from Diageo is Johnnie Walker. And Johnnie Walker is kind of held up as the kind of gold star example of having an effective strategy and making it work. And it wasn't always that way. If you think about Johnnie Walker originally, up until about 2000, they came up with, at the time, this brand benefit that Johnnie Walker inspires personal progress. It was a change from what they were doing. And they said, we're going to stand for inspiring people to have personal progress and celebrate that in their lives. And once they got to that, and it was done, like everything else, there's about 18 people at Diageo that take credit for coming up with that. But when they got to that, say, all right, now we got to execute it. And the first thing they did, it seems silly, but they said, you know what, this works for us because it's who we are. Because you can actually progress through our brands. You come in, starting drinking Johnnie Walker Red, and then if you make it big one day, maybe you climb up to be a Johnnie Walker Blue drinker, right? You can progress through our portfolio, but we're going to inspire you to progress through your life. And not shortly after, they said, well, also our guy's walking backwards. So now we've got to get him walking forwards. Little things, but this is what goes on once you're executing your strategy. But then with that came what's, again, the most famous campaign in the spirit industry, which is the Keep Walking campaign. All right, this launched in 2000, and there's tons of video work and things behind this, but everything they did was driven through Keep Walking. And you've seen the print ads, you've heard about it, but Keep Walking is the greatest example of having a strategy and sticking to it. And again, not everyone's in the spirit industry here, but if you look at their results, Scotch and Johnnie Walker overall were a very big declining category in the late 1990s, early 2000s. When that launched in 2000, again, not everything happens overnight, but it changed, it changed not only Johnnie Walker, but it actually, in kind of the rising tide theory, it helped bring Scotch back. It made Scotch more interesting, and it's really held up all by strategy. They came up with an effective strategy, they stuck to it, and they drove it year after year until it really broke through with consumers. The other one a little closer to home is Woodchuck cider. Everyone knows, is familiar with Woodchuck. One of the original craft ciders, started in 1991 in Vermont. They basically have had the category to themselves up until the last couple of years with the launch of Angry Orchard and others. And they were happy. They were selling some cases, doing a nice job, and they sold 2 years ago to C&C over in Europe. And then they realized that it's kind of like who moved my cheese. Angry Orchard comes in and boom. And they went through the same kind of exercise and said, all right, what are we going to stand for? And they realized through their own exercise that, listen, we need to treat cider like craft. And in craft beer, you have commercial crafts like Blue Moon and Shock Top, et cetera. And that's, Andy put up the slide and how consumers see those brands, and they see them somewhat in the same space. Well, we got to do the same with cider. And they really realized that we're a craft cider, so let the other brands be the commercial ciders, but we got to reposition us as a craft cider. And they had a problem, because they looked like that. And said, how are we going to evolve and get behind our brand so it reflects our position of moving to a craft cider? So, and this is all recent stuff, they really said, all right, let's more behave and and they make great cider, but we got to do things that much more represent our strategy of being a craft cider, not a commercial cider. And so local nectar brewed with only Vermont, or using only Vermont apples. Out on a Limb, which changes brands, but not the six-pack carrier, so they don't have to introduce it every time. They just change the bottles that go inside it. Hop Station, obviously a hop-forward cider. And then Cluster Chuck, which is their mixed cider 12-pack. You know, a lot more craft than where they were. And Terry Hopper, who's here, who's the head of sales, told me about their launching Gumption. And he said, this is Gumption, great story behind it, talked about P.T. Barnum, talked about drinking cider to give him the gumption to be the guy he is. And I'm like, I'm looking at that story going, where's that? You have no story here. It's just another brand in your portfolio. And so they came to us and said, well, help us solve that. And you said, all right, well, let's get behind this brand and see what it stands for. And what you learned is, like, you know, tell your story through the brand, and we're going to talk about that next. But if you're going to have this background, you're going to have these backstories, you got to let consumers know. It's a huge difference. They're not just going to go and take the initiative to find it on themselves. You need to put it in front of them so they can kind of discover it right there. You know, still early days, but their movement from there to where I just showed you is going to make a big difference in their future. So what's the one thing? Anyone know what's the one thing that consumers see? All right, I'll answer it. Packaging, right? They might not see your TV ad, they might not see your cool Facebook post, they might not see your tweet, but when they're in that store looking at you, they're going to see your packaging, and you have to get that right. So, you know, WORMTOWN's a brewery, if you haven't heard of them. They're out of Massachusetts, pretty much known for they just won the U.S. Open Beer Championship this year, brew great beers, and they said, hey, we're doing great, what do you think of our brand? And so we looked them up and said, you brew good beer? And they said, so what do we do? So again, going back to who they are, what they stood for, we went about it, and we said, all right, let's rethink who you are and come up with a new flagship for you. So we started by, you know, they're out of Worcester, Massachusetts, which is an old printing community. So we gave them this kind of old stamp ink effect to their logo and trademark. And then we relaunched their series of brands. Be Hoppy, the guy that invented the original smiley face, Harvey Ball, was from Worcester, Mass. So let's return to that original smiley face that he developed. You know, Roger Goddard invented the original liquid-fueled rocket from Worcester, Mass. Let's do Bottle Rocket Pale Ale. Again, you don't need to know the story in the front, but it's a great backstory, and it's authentic to who they are. Warthog Wheat, they use Warthog Wheat from Western Massachusetts in their beer. Let's talk about that, right? That's cool. And let's make sure all that hangs together. They had a really no seasonal line. So let's readdress your seasonal line. So we reconcepted all their seasonals. Blizzard of 78, very famous storm in New England. Let's brew a winter IPA with 78 IBUs. You know, Puxatawny Pills, right? Same thing. Groundhog Day, Puxatawny Phil, you know, relevant in the Northeast. You know, Blonde Cougar. They liked that one. That was theirs, actually. But we did design it. But the idea is, like, let that story and that packaging all together. Consumers see that, and if you think of that from them, you know, they're in the process of opening a new facility, and they're gearing up for a much more regional expansion. They're ready to do that. And the last one is Otter Creek. So Otter Creek, same thing in Vermont. Been around, many of you know, since the early 90s, and that's what they've looked like, okay? And they had nothing to lose. They were declining, and they just decided, you know, we got to reinvent ourselves. They had one guy, Mike Gerhardt, their brewer. Big personality, well-known, drives around in his VW van with his dog, and everyone in Vermont knows who he is. So why don't we reconcept around Mike, right? Nothing to lose. All right, and then said, let's take it one step further. Let's reconcept our seasonal lines. All about Mike, right? And this is called the Mike Gerhardt Brewmaster Series. You know, brands like Overgrown and Citra Mantra, and this is who he is. And if you go online, we're not going to play the video. You'll see the videos that he does when he introduces brands. It's now showing their DNA. And if you look at their results, which they wouldn't let me share exactly their results, they, in the last few years, were declining strong single digits. You know, they were that, you know, older brand that hadn't kind of got the next wave. Now, they're up double-digit growth. they're back to positive territory with nothing more than redesigning who they are and being more authentic. And now doing that, like again, if you go look up that brand and see their videos, they're all about that. So last thing, what do I wish I knew? What do I wish I know now that I knew then? A few, little things. If you work with an agency, whether it's designing your packaging, your tap marker, your coaster, make sure you're with the senior people, okay? Have a relationship with them. Don't let it be the account manager. Don't let it be a junior guy. Have a seat at the table and demand that share of mind and share of heart, the SOM, SOH. That's what we talk about with our wholesalers too, right? I want share of mind based on the amount of business I've represented to you, but I'm going to win share of heart because I want you to like me and really want to over-deliver for me. And Boston Beer was notorious for evaluating share of mind and share of heart with a wholesaler. And that share of heart's super important. Be directly involved. Don't think like we have to get out of the way and let them do it. It's your brand. Like, get involved, because at the end, if you get there and you see something, they're like, oh, you're not the consumer. The millennials will love it. Bullshit. Sorry. Make sure that you have a say and you like it. It's your brand. It's personal. Don't be blocked by the account people, right? Be with the creatives. Be with the ownership, the people that are there. And then, a couple other things is, the name, in my example with Boston Beer, the name on the door means nothing, right? Whether this agency's done this before, that before, get a group of people that you really trust and you think can do a great job for you, are in it for the long run, versus just hiring anyone because they did X, Y, or Z for some brand, some universe, from a guy that might not even be there before. And always going back to strategy, think with discipline. Ensure whatever you're doing, you have the path, whether it's 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, you have that path, you feel good about it, and then execute and try things. Again, 1 out of 3, Hall of Fame. It's okay to take some swings and misses. Clearly you saw that in the Sam Adams example, all right? But eventually you'll get that hit that you want and you can build from that. But make sure you're on strategy and you know that what you're doing now is going to help you down the road. And that's it.